Today, I continue my exploration of the decans of the Zodiac with Gemini 3, the third decan of Gemini. Gemini is an air sign. It's ruled by Mercury, the god of communication. He was Hermes in the Greek pantheon, who brought messages back and forth to the gods. Air signs all have to do with thinking and communication. They're all associated with the swords in tarot cards, if you're a tarot aficionado. And Mercury, or excuse me, Gemini is also a mutable sign. So it has this playful, flexible quality about it. We're going to find out that what differentiates this decan of Gemini from the other two is it has this sense of the battle being over, a completion of the thought process. Folks who have important planets or points in this part of the zodiac tend to be the truth tellers of the world, the people that perhaps want to ensure that we're looking at what reality is as opposed to what we wish it were. And sometimes they can tell that truth to their own detriment. We're going to find that in the case of Edward Snowden, who has his Mars in this decan. The famous comedian George Carlin has his Moon in this decan and enjoyed telling the truth in a funny way, which can be mercurial, about United States policies. We're also going to see Sigmund Freud had his Saturn here, and he was the guy who talked about the reality principle and so forth. There's a lot to unpack. If you enjoy the video, like and subscribe. It helps people find my content. So the first step we always take in exploring the decans is to look at which planets rule the decan. Of course, we have Mercury that rules the whole sign, so he's got some energy here. But then we also have Saturn and the Sun. Under the Chaldean order, the Sun is responsible for this decan, and under the triplicity system, Saturn is. So when we blend the energy of these three planets, we get the vibe of something about consciousness. The sun has to do with what we know, what we can see, because the sun shines light on reality. And then the limitations, or what is real, what is possible, Saturn. And then communication, Mercury. And ideas, Mercury. So when we put all three of those together, we can really get the essence of this decan, that people with planets here can tend to be people who want to shine a light, the sun, on what is real. Saturn's the last planet we can see with the naked eye. He's about what's real, what's possible in the material world. He does not bullshit you the way Jupiter might. Love Jupiter. He's an expansive, optimistic, happy energy, but he can sometimes inflate the truth. Saturn does not do that. Saturn's like, what is real? And they may also, people with planets in this decan may use their voice to communicate about the truth. Hence the examples of Edward Snowden and George Carlin, and also Sigmund Freud and other folks. So after we look at the planets that are responsible for the decan, we can also look to ancient esoteric texts like Ibn Ezra and the Picatrix, as well as Agrippa. I'm just going to quote from Ibn Ezra first, and some of the language here is a little wonky because it's like from the 14th century, so hold that in mind, but you'll get the vibe. So Ibn Ezra says that this face of Gemini is, quote, a man seeking arms who has a bow and a quiver, and in his hand an arrow and clothing and golden ornaments. And he desires to play music and laugh and mock in all sorts of ways. So the idea of laughter and mocking, we really see that in George Carlin, who was a comedian who loved to make fun of the truth about some of the crazy shit that the United States did back in the 60s and 70s. And then we have the Picatrix, who describes this, or which describes this decan as a man garbed with a cuirass, holding a bow and arrows and a quiver. And this is a face of boldness, honesty, and the division and alleviations of labor. Then I'm going to say Agrippa, which is very similar, but just to round it out. Agrippa describes it as a man seeking for arms and a fool holding in the right hand a bird and in his left hand a pipe. And they are the significations of forgetfulness, wrath, boldness, jests, scurrilities, and unprofitable words. So from those last two, we get the idea of boldness and honesty, as well as jests. So the jests part, you can bring in George Carlin, but if you think about Edward Snowden, there was a boldness about his move to release the classified documents that led him to have to flee the United States. I'll talk more about his biography later, but just trying to get you to see how this decan can be about bold action that's also a little bit at times funny, or trying to poke fun, or trying to speak the truth to power. Then if we look at the tarot cards and the associated numerology and Kabbalistic ideas that are associated with this decan, we have the 10 of Swords in the Rider-Waite deck is right here. And here we see a man lying face down with 10 swords in his back. As Rachel Pollack notes in 78 Degrees of Wisdom, it takes only one sword to kill someone. This is kind of overkill, including a sword in his ear. But we see at the same time in the distance, the skies are clearing, and we get this sense of an insight or some understanding. So if you look at this card symbolically, you get the sense of a completion of a thought cycle. I say thought because swords are always about thinking, right? And as well as about communication and ideas. And the completion, the total decimation, this is the end of this position or idea, is carried within this card. We also, if you remember, the last card or last decan we looked at was the 9 of Swords, the second decan of Gemini. There, it was before the moment when the insight or the realization of the truth hit this person. In the 9 of Swords, we see a woman up at night having a nightmare. And if you know anything about depth psychology, you understand that when we're in a position where some new insight is trying to penetrate consciousness, we often get in a position where our mind goes crazy. It's called perseveration, and everything's flying around in your mind until the moment you integrate the truth and it settles into your body. And that's where we get to this 10 of Swords, the lightning flash of revelation about the thing perhaps that you didn't want to know and the whole world didn't want to know. Now you know it, and knowing it can lead to your ruin. It can lead to difficulty, right? When you speak the truth about that which people might not want to hear the truth. And so this ruin, the 10 of Swords, is the Thoth Tarot deck description for this card and this decan. So if we put all that together, we can see that people with points and placements like the ascendant, etc., in this part of the chart may be people who see things, see reality, and perhaps speak something about that reality. The speaking comes from the Mercury. And so applying these concepts to the examples that I gave, we can look at, or let me go back for a second, because I do want to add one little last piece, which is the number 10, which I mentioned can have to do with completion. It's the last numbered card in any suit. And the number 10 numerologically from the Kabbalah or the Hermetic Kabbalah is the Sephirah or Sephirah Malkuth, right? And Malkuth has to do with the culmination of the unmitigated energy of the idea. That's from Crowley, who wrote the book about the Thoth Tarot deck. And 10 is the number of transformation. It symbolizes the emanation of the material world. It's like the most concentrated energy of each of the suits. So here, the most concentrated energy of the swords or thoughts that leads to this final idea. Okay, so now let's move on and talk about the lives of two of the main people who have planets in this deck. And the first is Edward Snowden, and his Mars is the god of war, is in this decan of the Zodiac. I believe Gemini is also his rising, but his ascendant is in one of the earlier points of Gemini. And Edward Snowden was a former CIA technical assistant and an NSA contractor, and he disclosed classified information or documents in 2013 that revealed the US government's extensive surveillance programs, including they were collecting global phone records and internet activity. And on his own, he voluntarily he disclosed these documents, and then he revealed his identity and took the repercussions, stating that his goal was to inform the public about the NSA's invasive operations, which he believed threatened democracy and personal freedoms. He had a really comfortable life. He was making over $200,000 a year. And after he disclosed this information, ultimately he had to flee the country. He is now in Russia. He sought asylum there. And like I was saying, Snowden had his Mars in this deck, and he suffered like a more difficult fate than George Carlin, who was also a truth teller, who had his moon there, right? Moon's a very different planet than Mars. Mars is what we call a malefic planet. It can lead to difficulties in our lives in the material sense. And so he ended up really making a great sacrifice by revealing these documents and suffering the consequences. He made a bold choice. Remember how we talked about that idea of being bold from the Ibn Ezra text to expose these surveillance practices. And this was a clear act of conscious awareness. Remember the sun, it relates to conscious awareness, and the sun rules this decan. And he wielded this, or he did this through communication, through using his Mercury. Mercury rules the sign. And he suffered the harsh consequences and told the truth, the reality. That's Saturn, the last planet that rules this decan. And Saturn's also can represent the government, and he suffered the consequences, right? The government came down hard on him. I believe he also has Saturn conjunct Pluto in his birth chart, which can bring sort of this sense of imprisonment or being, sort of held down in our lives. So I just thought that was interesting. And then the tarot card associated with this deck, and the Ten of Swords, illustrates these themes of intellectual and spiritual catharsis, right? This is a card, whoops, where did it go? That can kind of have to do with that cathartic moment when you realize the truth and you let go and you speak it no matter what the consequences are, right? And it can dismantle illusions. That's the idea of this card, and sort of transform us through disclosing the truth. Yeah. So then going on to George Carlin, just if you don't know much about his life, he was, whoops, I'm going to find my notes on George Carlin. He used humor to illuminate the harsh realities about politics, right? Religion and human behavior, and he challenged his audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about the world and themselves. He embodied the energy of the third decan of Gemini through his sharp intellect, his bold communication. Remember, Ibn Ezra referred to this, people with planets in this decan as being bold, and his fearless critique of societal norms. Yeah, I think that's good. And you should go if you get a chance. I'm a little older, so I remember when I was little, hearing some George Carlin monologues, and they are hilarious, but they are also biting social critique, and it's worth checking out to get a sense of the vibe of this decan. One last thing I would like to mention, Sigmund Freud, the famous psychologist, had his Saturn in this decan. So Saturn had some extra power for him. And if you read any of his work, he's very much about the reality principle, was one of the phrases he used in working with clients, and the need for us to see the truth of what reality is, as opposed to being lost in the fantasies or the fantasy world that we created out of our illusions and our fantasies, our dream world, to see the truth of what happened to us as children and how that affected to us, as opposed to some of the stories we tell ourselves to protect ourselves from the truth or the painful truth that comes with some of the difficulties of being raised in any family. Right. And lastly, I don't know if I mentioned, but I think it's worth noting that Albert Hofmann, who was the scientist known for being the first person to make LSD and ingest it and learn about its psychedelic effects, was had his rising sign in this deck, and that's Albert Hofmann. And if you know anything about LSD or being under the effects of psychedelic substances, they enable you to, when they're at their best, to see the truth of reality, as opposed to, again, to get you out of the mental constructs and the illusions and the ideas that are blocking you from seeing the truth of what is. So I just thought it was fascinating. He had his ascendant degree in this part of the zodiac. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in about 10 days for the first decan of Cancer. Thanks so much.